So I was being a performance poet in New York City, a feminist poet, all that stuff, and seeing my daughter on weekends and holidays and all that stuff. And then I was meeting the Grail. And
how did you meet the Grail?
Okay. My father died. He went to sleep one night, and then he didn't wake up again. He had a heart attack. And that was sort of a shock. It sort of took life and turned it upside down. And I found myself at that point probably more traumatized than I realized, and this spiritual longing started coming up in me again, having abandoned Catholicism and Christianity because it didn't make sense for me anymore. And having tried astrology and having tried all these different types of esoteric spiritualities, I knew that they weren't it because they weren't hitting in the same place that Catholicism had once hit for me. I mean, I was really into the religion as a child. I would go make visits to church. I would work myself into a prayer frenzy. And it was real. It was real. And so nothing was doing it. And then here's my dead dad. And like, what does life mean when someone you love can just be gone? One day they're there, and then the next day they're poof, gone. So what's the point of a life? And that sent me into a bookstore, and I started to pick up stuff by Thomas Merton, who's this famous Trappist monk who's quite well known for trying to bring together various spiritualities. And I was reading his book, and suddenly I had to start having these feelings, I want to be a nun. And I said, well, this is ridiculous. I do not want to be a nun. But maybe I want to live with nuns. And I could clean their house. And they could be in silence and walking through the halls. And I could be in contemplation and have that feeling of closeness to whatever this spirit thing is. So I started asking around if there were any, nuns looking for someone.
Can I come clean your house?
And I live with you, and don't make me pray with you, but can I be around it?
It's a great way to learn.
And then I remembered some priest I knew from Brooklyn College who I'd known from political activities there. And I went and I told him. He said, well, it's a funny thing you're asking me that, because I was just up at this place in Cornwall, New York, called the Grail. I said, the Grail? What is the Grail? You asked me that just now, didn't you? And he said, I don't know. He says, they're the semi-religious group of women in upstate New York. Now, of course, I have since told Grail women that they were defined as semi-religious. They were like, what does semi-religious mean? Anyway, he told me about them. I gave them a call. And they said I could come up and visit. And I eventually did. And the minute I hit the property, not quite sure what they were, but I finally saw a definition. It said the Grail, as what I just gave you, basically. The Grail is an international movement of women committed to spiritual search, social change, and the release of women's creative energy throughout the world. Now, that was in the late 70s. Since then, we've added ecological sustainability.
That's important.
That's
very
important.
Necessary.
Yes, and that's like a new insight from the last 20 years. But, so I saw that. I said, that's okay, because I was scared to death of getting in with these, Catholic Christian people who could be nuns or semi or I didn't know what. But I went anyway, because they kept writing me letters. I was supposed to go, and then I didn't go, and they called me, and they said I should come, and they pursued me. And they said, and you should come this weekend, and then Ann Burke will be showing her slides from South Africa. And I thought, oh, great, I need to watch some old lady's, slides from her vacation. I was so unpolitical. And I never imagined what the slides would be. I thought it was going to be like giraffes and zebra in the Pampas or something. And it turned out, of course, it was the, pictures from the riots in Soweto.
And you saw these when
I went up for my visit, finally, yes.
So it totally politicized you going there?
Yeah, eventually it did. And they asked me, well, would you do your poetry? And it's like, oh my God, I don't know who these people are. I've been living the life in New York City, and now they want to hear I don't know what to tell them. But yet I want to tell them the truth, because I'm thinking I'm going to come live with them. They should know a little bit of who I really am. So I had to choose carefully. And also a little concern, not everybody gets poetry. So I chose well. I sat down. We're in the living room. They're sitting around. And I started doing the poems, and they were right there. Their eyes are in my eyes, because that's what I would do, the performance thing. And I'm getting the energy off them, and then I'm giving it back, and they were there the whole time. and they laughed in the right places, and they looked serious in the other right places. I said, this is interesting. These people get poetry. So I found out much later, I mean, they have a whole history of culture. I mean, when the Grail began in the 20s, they were doing dramas, stadium dramas, with casts of thousands. And 20,000, 30,000 people would come to see it. This was in the era of the fascist movements. And the Grail was also begun as a young women's movement as an alternative to the fascist youth movements of the time, because everyone was idealistic, so they wanted to channel this into another kind of idealism that wasn't fascist. So, of course they knew what poetry was. They were reading poems and doing dramas all the time. They had a culture. So in addition to all this political stuff and all this understanding of the special role of women in the world, because that's what it was founded on, the idea of bringing women's sensibility into the public sphere, and that these women would have as rigorous a training, spirituality, as any nun or priest, but they wouldn't be nuns or priests. They would be ordinary folk living in the world. Some would raise families, some wouldn't. Some took a promise of celibacy, not a vow. It's not in the context of the Vatican. But within the context of that community, a vow, a promise of celibacy was made, which is an interesting option, I have come to understand. So all these different lifestyles together. And then discovering, yes, it came out of Catholicism, but in the 60s it went through a transformation. It became ecumenical, and then Jewish women were coming in, and so then it was interfaith, and then at that point that broke open, and then it became about just women in spiritual search. So you got all this diversity in lifestyle. You got all this diversity in spirituality. You got all this diversity in terms of some of them were Marxist-Leninists, and some of them were just sort of Democrats. And that whole, and everything in between, and maybe even a couple of Republicans, but they didn't, they didn't speak up too often. And then the age thing. You got these older women and then younger ones. At that time I was 29 when I came, and those women were already, many of them, 60 years old.